It's a pleasure to worship and to exalt the Lord, the one who is King of all creation, King of kings and Lord of lords, our Messiah. We're going to turn this morning to Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15 is in large part about the consequences of the good news of Messiah coming to the nations round about, reaching out to the world, and the transformation that was bringing for the early believers, the very earliest believers who were Jewish in Jerusalem. And it is a story where things have clearly been developing for a while. As we read in Acts chapter 11, Kepha has preached the Besorah, the good news, to Cornelius and his household. They are beginning to see more and more people who are not from Jewish backgrounds coming to faith in the Messiah. And the early believers are now beginning to grapple with what does this mean? And if we put ourselves back in their situation in the very first century, where good news has always revolved around God, the God of Israel, and the Jewish people, the people of Israel, and has always gone forth from Jerusalem, you can understand why the question is not how can a Jew be saved or come to faith in Messiah, but how can a Gentile, a non-Jew, come to faith in the Messiah. And of course, in our context as a Messianic Jewish congregation, that's really something and a question that we're very familiar with. How can a Gentile be saved? That was the question of the early believers. Complicating this is the fact that among the early believers, you not only have priests, as the book of Acts tells us, but we have Pharisees, as this chapter tells us as well. You have people from the most religious streams of Judaism, and these are only the two sects we are told about. We can assume that there are others who are less numerous, who come from others of the many sects of Judaism of that day, who are passionate about God, and because of their genuine love for God, when they found out about Messiah and came to believe that he is the Messiah, they took that passion, much as Rav Shaul did. Took that passion into their newfound understanding of who God is, our great God, who has now brought to us the Messiah. Their passion is informed by everything they have learned their entire lives. Their entire lives have been embedded and infused with studying the Torah, studying the prophets, reading the Psalms, and this is their scriptures. They are religious Jews. They are people who other Jews are looking up to and looking upon with favor in Jerusalem. They're exemplary in many respects. But this brings up an issue. Now, as the good news is going out to the world, what does this mean for someone who's not Jewish to come to faith in the Messiah? And this is where we read in Acts chapter 15 and verse 1, some men came down from Yehuda or Judah to Antioch and began teaching the brothers. So clearly you have people who are from Jerusalem and Judah. That's the area around Jerusalem, that province where many of the Jews have come to faith in Messiah. And they are traveling north to Antioch. This is very early days. Antioch is quite a distance, but it's still walkable within a few days. So there's a lot of people traveling back and forth. Antioch is actually one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire at the time. And so it's a very powerful, influential place. A lot of Jewish people living there, a lot of people from every imaginable background, because the Roman Empire reaches far to the east, far to the west, north and south. And then, of course, its influence extends beyond. And so these people come and they're going to Antioch because there are many people who've come to faith. The people in Antioch are also now becoming influential. So far, the gospel has been going forth from Jerusalem, but now in the last couple chapters, we've seen that the good news is also going forth from Antioch, with Shaul and Barnabas going and preaching in Cyprus and what is now Turkey. So they're traveling around, they're bringing the good news. This is a challenge. The Torah says, the prophets say, the law shall go forth from Zion. And here are preachers going forth from Antioch, not Zion. And as they go forth, they are teaching in a way that is raising some questions for the people in Judah. So they want to keep ownership of this. Of course, naturally. They want to make sure the right message is being taught and that people are learning the right things. And so these religious people who are so motivated to teach the Torah the way they understand it, send emissaries to Antioch. And the message is, you cannot be saved unless you undergo circumcision, or Brit Milah, we call it, the covenant of circumcision, in the manner prescribed by Moses. You can not be saved unless you're circumcised. That's obviously for the men. That's what they are teaching. And they're not only teaching that there is circumcision required, but they are also teaching that it has to be according to the custom of Moses. So there's two things at play here. There's the Torah, but there's also the customs, the ethe of Moses, which are the oral law. They are the interpretations that the Jewish people have made of how to implement Moses' law. And anyone who reads the Torah can understand this is necessary. When you read the Torah, it says what it says, but then you have to decide, how do I actually interpret this? If it says circumcision on the 8th day, what does that exactly entail? And so customs and traditions and rules that we call halachot have been developed regarding that. And for Jewish people, it's been pretty much understood these things have a lot of influence, and for many Jewish people, actually binding authority. In other words, who am I to go against the interpretations of those who have come before me and studied this before? So they are asking the people in Antioch to do two things. Take this step of identifying with Israel according to the Torah, and secondly, to accept the customs that go along with that. Now, we know the Lord himself did not necessarily go around willy-nilly destroying all those customs. But as we see in the Gospels, and we'll get into this again as we continue our Torah study, or our study of the life of Messiah on Wednesday nights in a couple weeks, we see that he pointed to its true meaning and always got back to the kernel of what it was all about. And so he would tell the Pharisees, it's good to tithe from the herbs as you do, being so careful. Even if you take a little bit of parsley, you tithe a little bit of it. even in such small things. It's good to be so careful, but really pay attention to the weightier matters of the law before you get too hung up on the little things. Don't neglect the little things, but pay attention to the weightier matters of the law. And so now these believers in Antioch, this great city, where Jews and Gentiles get along pretty well, they're friends with one another, they're neighbors with one another, there's a lot of integration, there's a lot of non-Jews in the synagogue, and honestly, there's probably quite a few Jews who participate in some of the pagan worship as well. After all, in the temples, there would be great banquets and all kinds of things. And so secularized Jews must have existed in that day as well. And of course, history says they did. But now, this news is coming to Antioch. You must be circumcised. And the believers there, put yourself in their position. If you can identify with the Gentile believer in Antioch, he has or she has probably come to the synagogue first and has probably had associations with Jewish people that have grown over time. And they've become intrigued with the good news. And then as time has gone on, they've begun to accept the teachings of Judaism. Many of them have come to understand that there is one true God. And then when the apostles and teachers have come from Jerusalem, they have heard that God has made a way for all nations, for all peoples to come to faith. They have heard that the Messiah has come. And they have said, this is exciting. And in their acceptance of the Messiah, the beautiful thing is, unlike today actually, in that day, when they accepted Messiah, they understood very clearly that this is the Messiah of Israel. And they were accepting the Jewish people into their hearts in a special way, and accepting the God of Israel in a way that today, when the good news is preached, is typically left out. But this is something they would have known very well in that early day, before the gospel became the tradition of nations. But it brought a conflict. If we are to believe in Messiah, do we really have to go through circumcision? It's a really tough thing for an adult to go through circumcision. People do it still. It happens sometimes with Jewish people from the former Soviet Union, for example. When they've come out of the Soviet Union, many have thought, well, maybe now I can express my Jewish identity, and some who've become religious have undergone circumcision. It's still done today. If a person who's not Jewish wants to join the Jewish people and faith, if they are males, they're circumcised even today. But it's a big step. And so, of course, people are going to think about it. It's not the same as simply, am I going to stop eating pork? This is a big issue and something that really hits home. So they brought them in no small measure of discord and dispute with Shaul and Barnabas, because they are teaching the good news is going out to the world. It is for the world. It is for everyone, and they are not teaching that Gentiles need to be circumcised. So Shaul and Barnabas are arguing. This is a point of contention within the congregation in Antioch. Shaul and Barnabas have already been on their first expedition, bringing their version of the good news out to Cyprus and Turkey, and people are saying, we'd better nip this in the bud. We don't want this to get too far. So teachers are going from Jerusalem, and there they are in the city. And so this is such a controversy that the congregation assigns Shaul and Barnabas and some of themselves In other words, people from both sides are going, people who can explain the situation fairly and represent everything, to put this question before the emissaries and the elders in Jerusalem. And up they go. And it's interesting, Acts says, up to Jerusalem. That's the wording that Luke uses. It's very geographic language. To get to Jerusalem from Antioch, that's lowlands. You're going to travel through Lebanon. You're going to finally get to the Judean foothills, and you are going to go up to Jerusalem. It's significant, not simply because Jerusalem's high, but because scripturally it is spiritually high. There's a spiritual significance to Jerusalem on high. And so we read in verse 3, after being sent off by the congregation, they made their way through Phoenicia and Samaria, in other words, recounting in detail how the Gentiles had turned to God, and this news brought great joy to all the brothers. So they're taking their time. You get the picture. They're walking. They stop overnight. They stop where other believers that they know or that friends of theirs know live. They are spreading the news that God is doing great things. And obviously, even though there are different opinions among the group, nevertheless, they are all rejoicing in what God is doing. And that's something we shouldn't forget. It's not that they didn't want the gospel to go out to the nations, whatever their opinions were. And they brought great joy to all the brethren. This is where we read in verse 4, on arrival in Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the Messianic community, including the emissaries and the elders. And they reported what God had done through them. But some of those who had come to trust were from the parties of the Perushim, the Pharisees, and they stood up and said, it is necessary to circumcise them and to address them, direct them to observe the Torah of Moshe. What else would you expect in the early days from Jewish people who have devoted their whole lives to the Torah that God gave to Israel, to the scriptures that even today are the vast majority of the scriptures that we hold? This is what they are focused on and what it teaches. It's going to take a big shift in thinking for them to understand that God is now moving beyond Israel, which is the focus of the Torah and the prophets, and now is actually moving to the nations, not forgetting Israel, but using Israel to reach the world. This is a new development. And so they began to look into the matter. Now, in the history of what David Stern in the Complete Jewish Bible translates as the Messianic community or the church. In the history of the church, there have been various crucial times when a lot of the leaders have got together to discuss issues that are of importance. Sometimes the results of those conferences have been really doubtful. For example, in 325 CE, the Nicene Council decided that they would no longer celebrate, at least in the western part of the empire, they would no longer celebrate Passover or the Lord's resurrection at the same time as Passover. Big controversy among the early believers, but in the 4th century, that's what they did. They separated it. That's why we even today celebrate in Christian churches, people celebrate the resurrection of our Lord on a different day than Yom HaBikurim, the day of first fruits, in the week of Passover, the biblical day that Yeshua rose from the dead. On the other hand, this conference, here we have Kepha, we have Yaakov, we have the other shlichim, the other emissaries, the apostles. They are there together. These are people who have learned from Messiah personally. They have their thinking framed by the greatest teacher the world has ever known. You know, on the way up here, every Shabbat, I pass a Sikh temple on the U.S. side of the border, and it's Guru so-and-so. Well, gurus, you know, people have their teachers. But Yeshua is the greatest teacher, and he taught the truth. And these disciples had the privilege of learning from him. And then they had the privilege that we too have of having the Ruach HaKodesh to help them to understand. And so they begin to look into the matter. Verses 6 to 11, the Ruach for the nations. The emissaries and the elders met to look into the matter. After a lengthy debate, Kepha got up and said to them, and it's a Jewish debate, remember. So it's not like, I was going to say it's not like a very British affair with the Roberts Rules of Orders, where people get up and take their turns to talk. It's probably more like PMQ, Prime Minister's questions. And particularly in England, those can get really raucous, and that's kind of the way it goes. My guess is this council was a lot like that. It was pretty raucous. They're a bunch of Semites together. They're arguing, they're expressing their opinions, and everything's getting out there. But finally, Kepha stands up, and everyone respects him, so now they're all going to listen to Kepha, Peter. And Kepha got up and said, "Brother, you yourselves know that a good while back God chose me from among you to be the one by whose mouth the Goyim should hear the message of the good news and come to trust." So he has something to say. And God, who knows the heart, bore them witness by giving the Ruach HaKodesh to them, just as he did to us. That is, he made no distinction between us and them, but cleansed their heart by trust. So why are you putting God to the test now by placing a yoke on the neck of the Talmudim, the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we have had the strength to bear? No, it is through the love and kindness of the Lord Yeshua that we are trusted and delivered. And it's the same with them. Read between the lines a little bit, and you can see what Kepha is saying here. He went and he preached to Cornelius and his household. Did anyone in that household get circumcised before the Ruach fell upon them? There's no record of that. The Ruach fell upon them, upon their faith and their acceptance of the truth. When they were overjoyed, the Spirit came upon them. And so why would we place a yoke on their neck? The yoke is, in Scripture, almost always referring to the Torah. The yoke of the Torah. It's something that we take upon ourselves. Not necessarily as a burden. In fact, Yeshua said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." It's not necessarily something grievous. It's not a bad thing to keep the Torah and to follow God's way. In fact, it is a blessing. But why place this yoke on them? This is the customs as well as the Torah that we ourselves didn't have the strength to bear. It's too much. No, it is through the love and kindness of the Adon, the Lord Yeshua, that we trust and are delivered. And it is the same with them. It is the ahava, the chesed, the loving kindness of God, the love and kindness of God by which we come to faith. This is something I know that we all agree on. We believe that we have a relationship with God, not because of our deeds, not because of the Torah, but because of faith. And everyone kept still as they listened to Barnabas and Shaul tell what signs and miracles God had done through them among the Gentiles. Verse 13, Yaakov broke the silence to reply, "Brothers," he said, "hear what I have to say. Shimon has told in detail what God did when he first began to show his concern for taking among the Goyim, the nations, a people to bear his name. And the words of the prophets are in complete harmony with this, for it is written." And this is what he says. And he begins with a quotation, and you could turn with me to Amos chapter 9 and verse 11. He quotes from this in Amos chapter 9 and verse 11. This prophet, he's one of the minor prophets, which is why it'll take you a little longer to find, because just a few pages to find among the 1,000 plus pages of your scriptures. But when that day comes, I will raise up the fallen sukkah of David. And I've mentioned this before, but what do we say in the daily prayers among the Jewish people? We pray for the rebuilding of the fallen sukkah, the fallen tent of Yishai. That's David's grandfather. It's the same thing. It comes from this thought. God is going to raise up the household of David, which is raising up the household of Yishai, of Jesse. I will close up its gaps, raise up its ruins, and rebuild it up as it used to be. This is a great prophecy. This is exciting. It relates to Messiah, the King of David, from King David's household, coming into his proper place, his role among the people of Israel. This is the raising up of the fallen sukkah of David. Things are going to be repaired. Things are not right for Israel. And therefore, God is now making it right. And of course, this is going to be good news. Put yourself back in the first century. You're a minority as Jews in the Roman Empire. Jews are only a majority maybe in the Galilee and in the area of Jerusalem. So you really feel intensely your minority status. And on top of that, you're kind of oppressed by the Roman Empire with all of its rules, regulations, and taxes. And so the people of Israel don't have the full freedom that God intended for the people of Israel to have. Now, with Gentiles around the Roman Empire coming to faith in Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah of Israel, coming to faith in the God of Israel, this is good news. All of a sudden, Israel has a lot more friends in the Roman Empire as people accept this good news. Israel today is a beneficiary of people who have great love for Israel because they love the God of Israel, because of the scriptures. Israel today is also benefiting from this, and this is the way it should be. Many times in history, people have turned away and essentially from the God of Israel and persecuted the Jewish people, but love for the God of Israel is right. And so they're looking at this, and this is a good thing. People from the nations are coming to faith. This is what Yaakov does not quote, so that Israel can possess what is left of Edom and all the nations bearing my name, says Adonai, who is doing this. But this is his interpretation in Acts 15 and verse 17. So that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord. That is, all the Goyim, all the nations who have been called by my name, says Adonai, who is doing these things. This is good news and has been known for ages. It is in our prophets. We knew it. We know it today. This is something that God intends for the end of days. God is doing a great thing among the nations. So this is essentially the message of the prophets. But now we continue, and this is where we need to see the conclusion. What does this mean? Therefore, Yaakov says, and it's so significant historically that Yaakov is the guy who makes the conclusion to this whole argument. Kepha has made the argument. Yaakov has stood up and has summarized and recapped it and given it a biblical basis. And now he is the one who is proposing. History records he was viewed as a righteous person by the people of Jerusalem. And actually, some historians even think that his persecution and martyrdom, his death, was one of the things that led up to the Jewish revolt of 67 to 70. But therefore, he says, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Goyim who are turning to God. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from fornications, from what is strangled, and from blood. We'll deal with verse 21 in a minute. But here now are 4 requirements. Elsewhere, we know that this is given by the Ruach as well. The Ruach is working within them, these 4 requirements. Where did they come from? Again, now this is like a great thing that scholars can write a few articles on, maybe books, like where did this come from? But there's this famous argument that this comes from the Noahic laws. If you happen across a Lubavitch sukkah mobile or mitzvah van or something like that, if you're Jewish, they'll try to get you, if you're a woman, to take the Shabbos candles so you can light Shabbos candles at home. If you're a guy, they'll try to get you to lay tefillin so that you will at least have obeyed that commandment. Whatever ones you're disobeying, at least you will have done that. That's all good, fine and good. But if you're not Jewish, they will probably give you a little pamphlet about the 7 Noahic laws. This is something that developed in Jewish tradition in answer to the question, what does God require of the nations? And 7 Noahic laws have been categorized in the Talmud. They came out of the Mishnah and then the Talmud. But the fact is, these laws, while they may have had their origins back in Yeshua's time and in that era, nevertheless, they were never documented or systematized in that time. Now they actually come much later. And really, this idea that Acts chapter 15 and the command for the church is based on the Noahic laws is probably wrong. So here's a better theory, in my opinion. This is opinion of a guy called Jervel. And it's been, it makes a lot of sense. Leviticus chapter 17 and 18. They come in a interesting part of the Torah where the law is being given out. And at this point, the Torah is now dealing with issues that are incumbent upon not only Israel, but the stranger within the midst. And so in Leviticus chapter 17 and verse 8, when someone from the community of Israel or one of the foreigners living with you offers a burnt offering or sacrifice without bringing it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to Adonai, that person is to be cut off from his people. There's a lot of interesting things you could say and observe in that verse, but it's really clear if you are living with Israel, if you are, even if you're not actually officially Israel, but you are part of Israel in the sense that you are part of the greater community of Israel, you don't commit idolatry. This is something that is required. And if you do, then you are to be cut off. In other words, You're to be banned. You are to be shunned and no longer be considered part of the community. Then we continue. We continue with the command in verse 13. When someone from the community of Israel or one of the foreigners living with you hunts and catches game. It's not every command in the Torah where God says whether it's you or the foreigner among you. So there's something going on here. It's to do with living in Israel, as part of Israel, being joined to Israel. If you hunt and catch game, whether animal or bird that may be eaten, he is to pour out its blood and cover it with earth. In other words, you don't strangle the animal and leave the blood in the animal. You have to pour the blood out. Acts 15 specifically says you avoid drinking blood. You avoid meat from animals that are strangled. You don't eat flesh with its blood. Verse 14, for the life of every creature, its blood is its life. This is a command. Some people may disagree with me and say it's no longer relevant, that these are just cultural accommodations being made among the early believers. But it's a command that is being given from the earliest believers to the believers around the empire. It's being done under God's authority, and I believe it's still valid today. So therefore, we don't eat blood sausage. If you're in England, if you order the full English breakfast, it has this thing they call black pudding. Don't eat it. It's actually pig's blood, and it's rather awful on top of that. I hope none of my British friends will be angry at me, but it's simply in the scripture. Don't eat the blood. Pour it out. And so the same thing goes in verse 15. If you're eating an animal that dies naturally, is torn to death by wild animals, whether a citizen or a foreigner, you are to wash your clothes and bathe in water, and you will be unclean until evening. In other words, this is a questionable situation. You don't know how much of the blood remains in the animal, but it will render you unclean. It's not the same as if you intentionally ate it with its blood. And so you see, Acts chapter 15 reflects Leviticus chapter 17. Acts 15 also requires of all believers that we avoid sexual immorality. We might consider that a given. But it also is very closely tied to this passage in Leviticus, where in Leviticus chapter 18, following on from these commands to do with blood and things strangled and so forth, we are told, and idolatry, we are told to avoid sexual immorality. And there's a whole host of things which are probably at least PG-13 that are listed here in Leviticus chapter 18. The types of immorality that are to be avoided. And obviously they're not an exclusive list. They don't cover everything because people are unfortunately very creative. But nevertheless, you come to near the end of the list, and in chapter 18 and verse 26, you are to keep my laws and rulings and not engage in any of these disgusting practices which our world today is happily approving of, neither the citizen nor the foreigner living with you. These things, if not directly the source of the commands in Acts chapter 15, nevertheless reflect them very well. And reflect not only the 4 commands, but also reflect the context, in that this is for Israel and those who are living with them. And with these early believers, it is a community, especially in Antioch, of both Jews and non-Jews. This brings us to the final verse, verse 21. For from the earliest times Moshe has had in every city those who proclaim him, with his words being read in the synagogues every Shabbat. Now, I've had words about this with a couple people in our congregation, and I've been studying it as a result, and I did a little bit of studying, of course, for this sermon as well, reading a bunch of different commentaries and checking out their references as well, and also some messianic writings that have been written on this verse as well. One of the writers is a young Brazilian Jewish scholar who now lives in the United States, Isaac de Oliveira. He now goes by Isaac Oliver, maybe because Americans find Oliveira too hard to say, but I like the Oliveira. Nevertheless, he's brilliant, and he studies this section as well, and as a Jewish believing scholar, has a lot to say about Luke and Acts and the gospel and the early believers. And so there are a few different opinions about these verses, only two that really need to be noted. My previous view, that I think has some validity, but I'm not so sure about now, is that this is an accommodation. From the earliest times, Moshe has had in every city those who proclaim him. In other words, you need to accommodate the Jewish people that you are with. In other words, with this viewpoint, if you're in a place where there are no Jews, then this doesn't apply to you, because this is simply a cultural accommodation, and you want to be careful about offending other people. That's certainly valid, and that's certainly what I was taught growing up. But looking into it further, so my thanks to friends and thanks to other people who've written on this verse, the other interpretation that very respected people from across the spectrum will agree with, including F.F. Bruce, who's kind of an old school scholar from Manchester, well-known, standard, completely orthodox kind of guy, from a Plymouth Brethren Assemblies route. And we are actually meeting in a hall that is owned by a Plymouth Brethren or Christian Brethren Assembly. So he comes from that route. He's certainly completely sound scripturally. Says his preferred view is that here, what is happening is, here's this argument with the very religious, the Pharisees and the priests, the Sadducees, together, who've been arguing for the keeping of the Torah, and those who are arguing that the Torah does not apply in the same way to those who are not Jewish. Here, what is being said is that everywhere that there are believers, you will find that there are people who know the Torah and will be able to help people understand these laws better and to grow in their understanding of how they relate to the Torah. It's one of the issues we have in our congregation here. How do we relate to the Torah? We have in our constitution, we do not lay upon anyone any particular Mosaic ceremony, I think it said, at one point, or Mosaic tradition upon our members. We allow freedom of thought on this issue. But nevertheless, it seems at this point that what is being said is that in some way, all of us, all believers, whether Jewish or Gentile, the Torah is relevant to us. The Torah is important to us. We all understand, as Rav Shaul says, that in it is displayed God's righteousness. And as Rav Shaul also said, the Torah is good. None of us would say that these 4 commands are exhaustive of what God requires of us In there's no mention of theft. It doesn't mean that since these are not one of the 4 commands for the churches that we can then go and steal, and doesn't mean that we can also go and covet and that we can go and murder. But we are going to grow in our understanding of what God requires. That's what the Didache, my favorite book outside the scriptures, reveals, is that in the teaching of the Gentiles in the early church, they were very careful to teach the basics of the Torah, not the details, not those specific parts such as the festivals and the Shabbat and Kashrut, but to teach the basics of the Torah to those coming to faith. And so we see that actually this whole section of Scripture applies to us. It's meaningful for us. We don't need to be mystified about what it's about, but in it, God's righteousness is revealed. And so in Acts chapter 15, we understand that his words are being read in the synagogues every Shabbat, just as it was today. We had the words in Hebrew on the screen behind us, which I really liked. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. John did a pretty good job of expressing that in Hebrew. And we know that these words are words of life for us. This hasn't been particularly pastoral in a sense, but hopefully it's been helpful as we seek to understand, what does God require of me today? His righteous standard remains the same. Hopefully, as we continue to go through the Torah, as we study the scriptures, like these early believers, we will come to understand what the Torah means for each one of us, the more that we study.